In this video, we are going to see an overview of the changes that have been made in PHP 7.2 starting from PHP 7.1. In order to execute our code in two versions of PHP, I have set up a Docker Compose file that will be containing two services. The first service will be running PHP 7.1 CLI image, and the second one will be running 7.2 CLI image. Down here I have two terminals. In the first one, I'll be running this command over here, docker compose exec php 71, which is the name of service, and then bash in order to get into a container that is running this service. Now I'm going to execute php-v to see the version, and it is indeed 7.1. I will be doing the same for 7.2 and php-v, and that is php 7.2. So in this terminal we are going to execute our scripts against PHP version 7.1, and in this terminal over here we are going to execute our script against PHP 7.2. Alright, now let's get started with the first type of changes, which are the backward and compatible changes. Then we are going to see the new features. So the first backward and compatible change is concerning the number format function. Number format is going to format for us a number in a human readable format, and it will also optionally use the rounding half up rule to round our values. So let's see, for 0.5 for example, we are going to round this to 1. Why? Because the fractional value of this number is more than or equals 5. For 1.1 for example, we are going to round that into 1 also. Why? Because the fractional number is 0.1, which is strictly less than 5. So the rule here is to check the fractional number. If it is more than or equals 5, we are going to round up. Otherwise we are going to round down. We are going to see the execution of number format on all of these numbers, and the thing that we should notice here is that for minus 0.1, when we are going to round an item to minus 0, for 7.1 we are going to see that it gives us minus 0, and for 7.2 it has changed it to simply 0 without the minus sign, which is more human readable, because minus 0 is kind of strange into the human eye. Let's see the execution of those two scripts. So in 7.1, if I do PHP and then number format, I'm going to have the number format value for minus 0.1 is minus 0, for 0.5 is 1, and for 1.1 is 1, etc. Now for PHP 7.2, if I execute the same script, so PHP 1 number format.php, I'm going to have, instead of minus 0, I'm going to have 0. For the rest of values, they are basically the same except for minus 0. So that's the first change. So in recap, the number format function will be returning 0 instead of minus 0 for PHP 7.2. Now the second change is for converting numeric case in arrays and objects. Say that we have an array that is containing a single item with 0 being the index and 1 being the value, and I want to convert that array into an object. So I will cast it into an object, and then I will be dumping the object itself, and then I will try to access the items within the object. So an array that is converted into an object will be having simply the key value items transformed into property and value for that property. So for this case over here, we are going to have an object with 0 as property and then 1 as value for that property. In 7.1, if we try to access the value of that 0 directly without iterating over it, we won't be able to do that either with this notation or with this notation. Meaning that either considering the 0 as a string or an integer, we will be having null in both cases. The other way around also is valid. So if we have an object that has an attribute named 0 that have 1 as value, and we cast that into an array, then we dump that array, we will see that we have an array with one item, 0 being the index and 1 being the value. And if we try to access that item with this notation over here, r of 0, either with integer or string index, we will not be able to access that. Let's try that out in PHP 7.1. So if I execute PHP 2, convert numeric keys in arrays and objects, I will be having the first dump is for the object itself that we have converted from array, so this line over here. Then the two items over here that I have tried to display will be giving us null and null. So we were not able to access the value of 0. The same goes for the array. We have an array that have string 0 as key and then int 1 as value. And if I try to access the items of those arrays, either with the integer or the string notation, they are both evaluated to null, which is kind of problematic in PHP 7.1. Now all that got fixed in PHP 7.2. So if I change nothing in my code and re-execute again the same script in PHP 7.2, so if I'll be executing PHP and then the same file, I'll be having the object itself over here, and then I'll be having int1 and int1 for these two notations over here, which is a good fix that have been introduced. Otherwise we are not able to access those items. And the same goes for arrays. So the second dump over here, we have the array itself, and then we have int1 for both notations, either with the string or with the integer notation, which was not the case for PHP 7.1. One minor difference also is that property in the object itself is now a string instead of integer in PHP 7.1. So that's the second change. Now the third change is disallowing passing null to get class. Say that we have a class called bar, and within the constructor of this class we are going to call get class. Now if you call get class with null, in PHP 7.1 we are going to have the enclosing class as a result, which is bar in our case. Let's test that out. Let's clear the console and then execute PHP 3 disallow. And yes, we have bar as display because we are dumping get class of null. Now if I execute the same code in PHP 7.2, I'm going to get a false with a warning saying that we should not call get class on a null object. Now let's execute this in PHP 7.2. So 3 disallow passing null to get class. And yes, I'm having a warning, get class expects parameter 1 to be an object, null given in line 9. And I have bool false as a result. So that's a backward and compatible change that have been introduced. And if I want the same behavior as PHP 7.1, I simply can omit this argument over here. So I call get class without argument, and I will be having bar again as 7.1. So if I re-execute the same script again, I'm going to have bar as I did for 7.1. So if you want, for whatever reason, you want the same behavior as PHP 7.1, you simply have to omit the argument. Now the fourth change is for the count of non-countable items. Those 4 lines over here that I have for count are going to count something that is not countable. Either it's null or an integer or a string or a new object. So in 7.1, this code will execute without warning. If I do PHP 4, warning count non-countable, I'm going to have the count, which is 0, 1, 1, 1, and 2 for the array of 2 items without any warning issued, even if I'm calling count on something that is not countable, which is either an array or an object that is implementing the countable interface. Now in PHP 7.2, this has changed to show us a warning, but nonetheless it will execute and it will not block my script. So if I execute PHP 4, warning count non-countable, I am going to have the same result as I did in PHP 7.1, but with that I'm going to have a warning saying that parameter must be an array or an object that implements countable. And I did get this 4 times for those 4 items over here. So that's the fourth change. Now the fifth change is concerning the get type function on resources. Let's execute this script on PHP 7.1. What I'm going to do simply is to open a file. In our case it's docker-compose.yaml in read mode, and then I'm going to dump get type before closing the file and after closing it. So I'm going to dump get type of resource, then close it, and then call get type again on that closed resource. In PHP 7.1, I'm going to have a little bit strange display. Let's figure that out. PHP 5 get type on closed resource. So I'm going to have resource on line 6, which makes sense because we are dumping a resource. But then in line 8, after closing the resource, I'm going to have an online type, which is kind of bizarre. But in PHP 7.2, this got fixed. So if I execute PHP and then 5 get type on closed resource, I'm going to have a resource for line 8, which is a resource, and then for closed resource, I'm going to have resource and then close it between parentheses, which is a lot better and more understandable. So that's for the 5th change. Now the last backward and compatible change that I'm going to show here. The last change, and this is not the exhaustive list. If you want the whole list of the changes, you can visit the documentation. I'll be linking that in the description below. So the last change that I'm going to show here is concerning isObject function. So in PHP 7.1, when we call isObject on PHP incomplete class, on an object that contains a PHP incomplete class, we are going to have false. So if I execute this, PHP and then 6 isObject and PHP incomplete class, I'm going to have for this var dump over here false. Why? Because the object itself contains a PHP incomplete class. And you might ask, how did I get this PHP incomplete class? I did it simply by serializing an object. In my case, it's a basket that contains 2 products and an address, and then unserializing that same object, but allowing only the product to be unserialized. In my case, the address won't be serialized and it will be transformed into PHP incomplete class, which is the case that I'm displaying over here. So I have in my address is an object, and then between parentheses it's an object of PHP incomplete class, and the isObject is displaying false. Why? Because my basket is of type PHP incomplete class, and that is the display over here. Now if I do that, the same thing on PHP 7.2 and execute the same script, I'm going to have, if I execute PHP 6 isObject and PHP incomplete class, I'm going to have the same object that contains PHP incomplete class in the dump here, which is the dump that I'm having in this line. And then instead of false, I'm going to have true. So here I got false, and this in PHP 7.2 I got true. So in a recap, for PHP 7.2, if I execute isObject on a PHP incomplete class, I'm going to have true instead of false, which makes sense because it is an object, but we don't know the class of that object. That's for the backward and compatible changes. The first new feature of PHP 7.2 is the introduction of new type object. This new type can be used for parameter typing as well for return typing of functions. So if I have a function called test, it can take an object of type object and it can return object as well. Within this test function, I'm returning a new SPLQ instance, which is an object. I can call my test function with an object. For example, the return of JSON decode of an empty object over here is acceptable. The call of test with a new anonymous class is also acceptable because the result is an object. But if I return an array within my function, I'm going to have an error saying that we should not return an array, we should instead return an object. Let's test this code in our PHP 7.2. So if I execute PHP1 new object type, I'm going to have uncode type error, return value for test must be an object, an array is returned. So that's the first check for return type. Now let's return this object instead and try to call our test function with a string instead of object and see if PHP is going to have problem with that. And yes, it does have a problem with that by showing us an uncode type error, argument 1 passed to test must be an object string given. So this type is going to be checked for return type and for parameters types and for parameter types. That's the first new feature. The second new feature for PHP 7.2 is that now we are allowed to override abstract functions. In 7.1, if we define an abstract class A within a function test that is abstract, and then we try to override that function test in class B that extends A, we are going to have an error saying that we cannot do that. Let's test that out. So if I execute PHP 2 abstract method overriding in PHP 7.1 environment, I'm going to have an error saying can't inherit abstract function A test. Now if I execute the same code without changing anything in PHP 7.2, so PHP abstract method overriding, I'm not going to have an error. So PHP 7.2 has allowed us to redefine abstract functions in inherited classes. It has also allowed us, notice here that we are not having the exact same signature for the function, so we can broaden the argument type and we can narrow the return type. So overriding abstract function is allowed by maintaining contravariance for parameters and covariance for return types. Now the third change in PHP 7.2 is parameter type widening. Let's say that we have an interface A that contains a function test. This function will be taking a parameter of type array. This input here is of type array. In PHP 7.2 we can redefine this function and we can omit the type for input. This will be a perfectly valid code for PHP 7.2. Let's try that out. If I execute PHP 3 parameter type widening, we are not going to have an error over here. But for PHP 7.1, this will be giving me an error. So let's try that out. PHP 3 parameter type widening PHP. And we have an error saying declaration of B test must be compatible with A test. So PHP 7.2 has allowed us to redefine function and then omit the type if we want to, and that is called parameter type widening. The last change is for allowing trailing comma for grouped namespaces. So in PHP 7.1, if you want to use many items in the same namespace, we can use this notation over here, but the last comma here is not allowed. So if you execute in PHP 7.1 this code over here, PHP 4 allow, I'm going to have a syntax error because this last comma over here is not allowed. Now the same code is not going to give me an error in PHP 7.2. So if I execute PHP 4 allow trailing comma for grouped namespaces, I'm not going to have an error. You might be wondering why you are allowing this comma to be used in the last line. You might be wondering why you are allowing this comma at the end of the line. And if you have used VC, a version control system like Git, for example, and in a project that is used by many developers, so a lot of people can come and modify this single line, for example, the merge for conflicts is a lot easier if we have this rule over here of the comma allowed at the end of the line than if we don't have that. That's it for this video. Thank you all for watching. I'll be asking some questions to help you stick some informations that I have presented in this video. Feel free to answer them in the comments section.